October 14, 1943. The skies over Rabaul, New Britain. 18 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses materialized through the clouds, their aluminum bodies catching the tropical sun like a fleet of silver daggers. Below them, the most heavily defended Japanese stronghold in the South Pacific bristled with anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft. The bombers flew in a formation so tight, so mathematically precise, that it looked almost ceremonial, a deadly box floating through the sky at 25,000 feet. Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa watched them approach. With 87 confirmed kills to his name, he was one of the most feared fighter pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He destroyed American fighters, shot down bombers flying alone or in loose formations. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. The bombers weren't scattered or vulnerable. They were locked together in a geometric pattern that seemed to defy every principle of aerial combat he'd been taught. He signaled his wingmen. 21 Zeros dove toward the formation, their engines screaming, their 20mm cannons loaded and ready. What happened in the next 7 minutes would shatter everything the Japanese understood about bomber interception. Of the 21 fighters that attacked, only 9 would return to base. The B-17s, every single one of them, would complete their bomb run and return home. This wasn't an anomaly. It was mathematics. It was innovation born from desperation. It was the combat box formation, and it would revolutionize aerial warfare in ways that still influence military doctrine today. The story of the combat box begins not with triumph, but with catastrophe. In the early months of America's entry into World War II, bomber crews flying over both Europe and the Pacific were being slaughtered. The doctrine seemed sound on paper. Heavily armed bombers, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, could theoretically defend themselves against enemy fighters. The reality proved bloodier. Bombers flying alone or in loose formations were picked off with ruthless efficiency. German and Japanese fighter pilots developed tactics specifically designed to exploit bomber vulnerabilities, attacking from the sun, targeting engines, focusing fire on the cockpit or the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage. American bomber losses in 1942 reached catastrophic levels. Something had to change, or the strategic bombing campaign would end before it truly began. The B-17 Flying Fortress represented the pinnacle of American bomber design. 4 Wright Cyclone engines giving it a range of over 2,000 miles. A service ceiling of 35,000 feet. A bomb load of 4,800 pounds. But its most distinctive feature was its armament. Up to 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns positioned at strategic points around the aircraft. The nose, the dorsal turret, the ventral ball turret, the waist positions, the tail, every angle theoretically covered. But theoretical coverage and practical defense proved to be entirely different things. A single bomber, no matter how many guns it carried, could only bring a fraction of its firepower to bear on an attacking fighter at any given moment. The ball turret gunner couldn't help the tail gunner. The top turret couldn't assist the waist guns. Each position fought its own isolated battle, and skilled enemy pilots exploited these gaps with lethal precision. Major Curtis LeMay stared at the loss reports from the 305th Bomb Group and felt something close to despair. It was August 1942, and his unit had been operational in England for less than 3 months. Already, they'd lost a quarter of their aircraft. Not to mechanical failure or weather or accidents, but to enemy fighters tearing them apart in the sky. LeMay was 36 years old, a career officer with an engineer's mind and an innovator's instinct. He'd studied the after-action reports obsessively, interviewed every surviving crew member, analyzed gun camera footage frame by frame. The pattern was undeniable. Bombers flying in loose formations, the standard doctrine inherited from peacetime training, were dying. They needed something radically different. The fundamental problem was simple to state but fiendishly difficult to solve. Each B 17 had impressive firepower, but that firepower was diluted across multiple defensive positions. An attacking fighter only needed to avoid 1 or 2 gun positions to find a vulnerable approach angle. The waist gunners on the left side couldn't help the waist gunner on the right. The tail gunner fought alone. The nose gunner faced forward while threats came from every direction. LeMay began with a question that seemed almost childishly simple. What if the bombers could combine their defensive fire? What if, instead of 12 individual aircraft fighting 12 separate battles, they could function as a single weapon system, a flying fortress in the truest sense of the word? The mathematical challenge was staggering. Aircraft in formation needed to maintain precise spacing, close enough for overlapping fields of fire, far enough apart to avoid collisions or creating an easier target for anti-aircraft artillery. They needed to account for different aircraft in the formation having different responsibilities. They needed to create a three-dimensional defensive sphere where attacking from any angle meant facing multiple gun positions from multiple aircraft simultaneously. LeMay commandeered a warehouse at Grafton Underwood Air Base and turned it into something between a war room and a geometry classroom. He hung model aircraft from the ceiling with string, recreating formations at scale. He plotted firing arcs on massive sheets of paper pinned to the walls. He calculated angles, distances, fields of fire. He worked through the night, sustained by coffee and the knowledge that every day without a solution meant more of his men would die. The breakthrough came from thinking about the formation not as a group of individual aircraft, but as a single entity, a box. A three-dimensional geometric structure where each aircraft occupied a specific position, each position supporting every other position, the whole creating something greater than the sum of its parts. The formation would consist of 18 aircraft arranged in 3 levels. The lead squadron of 6 aircraft flew at the center altitude. 3 aircraft to their right and slightly above, the high squadron. 3 aircraft to their left and slightly below, the low squadron. Behind this front formation, 2 more groups of 3 aircraft each, staggered vertically to fill the gaps. But the real innovation lay in the precise spacing. The aircraft weren't simply clustered together. They were positioned with mathematical precision so that the firing arcs of their defensive guns created overlapping zones of death. An enemy fighter attacking from 12 o'clock high would face not just the nose guns of the lead aircraft, but the top turret guns of the aircraft below it and the nose guns of the high squadron. Attack from 6 o'clock low, and you'd face tail guns from 3 aircraft plus the ball turret gunners of the formation above. The vertical stacking was crucial. Aircraft at different altitudes meant that guns pointing downward from higher aircraft could engage targets that guns pointing upward from lower aircraft were also tracking. The overlapping fields of fire created a sphere of defensive coverage that was nearly impossible to penetrate without flying through concentrated machine gun fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. LeMay ran the calculations again and again, checking his work, looking for flaws. The numbers were staggering. A single B-17 could bring approximately 4 to 6 guns to bear on a target depending on the angle of attack. But in the combat box formation, an attacking fighter would face fire from 12 to 16 guns simultaneously, sometimes more depending on the attack vector. That meant 150 to 200 rounds per second of .50 caliber machine gun fire converging on a single point in space. But mathematics on paper meant nothing if pilots couldn't execute the formation in combat conditions. Flying in close formation required intense concentration under ideal circumstances. Doing it at 25,000 feet, in sub-zero temperatures, wearing oxygen masks, while being shot at, that would require training, discipline, and courage beyond anything the bomber crews had yet been asked to demonstrate. The first full combat box formation flew on November 23, 1942. Target: the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. 54 B-17s arranged in 3 combat boxes of 18 aircraft each. The crews had trained for weeks on formation flying, but none of them had yet faced the ultimate test, enemy fighters in combat. Lieutenant Robert Morgan piloted the Memphis Belle in the lead position of the high squadron. Through his headset, he could hear the calm voice of the formation commander calling out headings and altitudes. The bombers were locked into their positions now, each pilot focused entirely on maintaining precise spacing. Too close and they risked collision. Too far and they'd break the defensive sphere that might be the only thing keeping them alive. The German fighters came at them like hornets, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s diving out of the sun, their cannons flashing. In previous raids, this would be when the formation would start to come apart. Bombers would break formation to evade, isolated aircraft would become easy targets, and the disciplined German fighters would pick them off one by one. But today was different. The first FW-190 came in from 2 o'clock high, probably expecting to target the lead aircraft's vulnerable nose section. What the German pilot didn't know, couldn't have known, was that his attack vector put him in the crosshairs of 18 different gun positions across 6 different aircraft. The combined fire from the formation's top turrets, waist guns, and nose guns converged on his flight path like a steel wall. The Focke-Wulf disintegrated. Not hit by a lucky shot or disabled by accumulated damage, simply torn apart by the sheer volume of fire. Pieces of the fighter tumbled through the air, trailing smoke. The German pilot never had time to bail out. The radio crackled with terse observations from gunners across the formation. Bandit, 4 o'clock level. I got him. Wait, everyone's got him. Jesus, there's nothing left. The German fighters pressed their attack, but something had changed. The pilots were no longer facing isolated bombers they could pick apart methodically. They were facing a single, massive weapon system that could project devastating firepower in every direction simultaneously. A Messerschmitt 109 attempted the classic attack from 6 o'clock low, the dead zone under the tail that earlier bombers had struggled to defend. In the combat box formation, there was no dead zone. The tail gunners of the lead aircraft engaged. The ball turret gunners from the aircraft in the high squadron could depress their guns and join the fight. Even waist gunners from aircraft in diagonal positions could traverse their weapons and contribute fire. The Me-109 took hits from at least 7 different guns within 2 seconds. It rolled inverted and spiraled toward the earth, streaming flame. But maintaining the formation under attack required almost superhuman discipline. Every instinct screamed at the pilots to break formation, to evade, to take evasive action. They couldn't. Breaking formation meant death, not just for the aircraft that broke away, but potentially for the entire group as it disrupted the carefully calculated fields of fire. Sergeant Michael Aruth crouched in the ball turret of a B-17 in the low squadron. His world reduced to the circle of plexiglass around him and the twin .50 caliber guns in his hands. A Focke-Wulf flashed past, and he tracked it smoothly, firing in short, controlled bursts the way he'd been trained. Through his intercom, he heard other gunners calling out the same target. 3 aircraft, 6 guns, all firing at once. The German fighter seemed to stumble in mid-air, then fell away trailing debris. The formation thundered on toward the target, bombers shifting slightly to maintain spacing as aircraft in the lead positions took minor damage. This was another innovation of the combat box: redundancy. If one aircraft was damaged but could maintain formation, the other aircraft adjusted slightly to cover its gaps. If an aircraft had to leave formation, the remaining bombers tightened up to seal the hole in the defensive sphere. They reached the target. Bomb bay doors opened in sequence, a choreographed mechanical ballet at 25,000 feet. The Norden bomb sights in each aircraft tracked the target below. The lead bombardier triggered his release, and 18 aircraft dropped their payloads in a devastating cascade, 108 bombs walking across the submarine pens in a pattern of destruction that no amount of concrete could withstand. The German fighters made one final desperate pass as the bombers turned for home. The formation held. The guns fired. More German fighters fell. And then they were breaking off, low on ammunition, their attack broken not by evasion but by simple mathematics. You cannot penetrate a sphere of fire that concentrates over 100 machine guns on any attack vector. Of the 54 B-17s that flew that day, 51 returned to base. The 3 that were lost broke formation due to mechanical failure and were quickly dispatched by German fighters who'd learned to recognize and exploit such opportunities. But the aircraft that maintained the combat box formation came home, some shot up, some with wounded crewmen, but alive. The strategic implications became apparent within weeks. German fighter units that had been inflicting 15 to 20% losses on American bomber formations suddenly found their effectiveness cut by more than half. The combat box didn't make B-17s invulnerable. Nothing could do that, but it fundamentally changed the mathematics of aerial combat. Japanese commanders in the Pacific received reports of the new American formation tactics with skepticism. The European theater was different, they reasoned. Japanese fighters were faster, more maneuverable than their German counterparts. Japanese pilots were trained in aggressive, close-in fighting that had proven devastatingly effective against Allied aircraft throughout 1942. The Zero, in particular, was legendary for its agility. It could outturn almost any American fighter and had already established a fearsome reputation. They were wrong. When combat box formations began appearing over Rabaul, Truk, and other Japanese strongholds in late 1943, Japanese fighter pilots discovered the same brutal truth their German counterparts had learned. Agility didn't matter when you had to fly through a wall of .50 caliber bullets. Speed didn't matter when the formation's interlocking fields of fire meant there was no safe approach vector. The losses were staggering. In the raid on Rabaul on November 2, 1943, Japanese fighters suffered a loss rate of nearly 40% against B-17 formations while shooting down only 2 bombers, both of which had been forced to leave formation due to mechanical issues. The Zero's legendary maneuverability, so effective in dogfighting, became a liability. The aircraft's light construction, designed for maximum agility, meant it couldn't absorb punishment. A single burst from a .50 caliber machine gun could tear a Zero apart. In the combat box formation, Japanese fighters were facing not a single burst but concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with 64 confirmed kills, attacked a B-17 formation over New Guinea and barely survived. His Zero took 47 hits. He returned to base, landed his barely flyable aircraft, and submitted a report that his commanders initially refused to believe. The American bombers, he wrote, were impossible to approach. Any attack vector resulted in facing more guns than I could count. His recommendation was stark. Don't engage B-17s in combat box formation unless absolutely necessary, and even then, accept that losses would be catastrophic. The mathematical reality was inescapable. A Zero carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. Deadly weapons against individual targets. But a combat box formation could project somewhere between 150 and 200.50 caliber rounds per second in any given direction. The Zero pilot had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds to close within effective firing range, aim, fire, and break away. In that window, he'd be flying through what was essentially a solid stream of bullets. The odds were not survivable. German and Japanese tactics evolved in response. Rather than attacking the formations directly, fighters began focusing on bombers that left formation, damaged aircraft struggling to keep up, stragglers, aircraft with mechanical failures. They began attacking during the approach to the target, hoping to break up formations before they reached the bombing run. They developed specialized armament, heavier cannons, air-to-air rockets, that could engage from beyond the effective range of .50 caliber guns. But these adaptations came too late. The combat box formation had already achieved its primary purpose. It allowed strategic bombing campaigns to continue with acceptable losses. Acceptable is a cold, bureaucratic word that meant thousands of young men still died in burning bombers over Europe and the Pacific. But it meant those deaths achieved strategic objectives that might have been impossible with the higher loss rates of 1942. By mid-1944, the combat box had become standard doctrine not just for the B-17 but for all American heavy bombers. The B-24 Liberator formations adopted the same principles. Modifications were made. The British developed their own version, the bomber stream, which emphasized different aspects of the same basic concept. The Soviets studied American formation tactics and incorporated elements into their own doctrine. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Before the adoption of combat box formations, American bomber losses in Europe averaged 8 to 12% per mission. After widespread adoption of the formation, losses dropped to 3 to 5%. In the Pacific, the impact was even more dramatic. Losses dropped from an unsustainable 15% to below 4% for most missions. This didn't just save lives. It made the entire strategic bombing campaign viable. The combat box formation represents a pivotal moment in military history, though its significance has been overshadowed by flashier innovations: the atomic bomb, radar, the jet engine. But in many ways, the combat box was more revolutionary than any single piece of technology. It represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, from viewing weapon systems as individual units to understanding them as components in a larger, integrated system. Modern air doctrine traces its roots directly to the lessons of the combat box. The concept of mutual support, of creating overlapping fields of fire, of understanding warfare in terms of geometric relationships and mathematical probabilities. These ideas now permeate everything from fighter tactics to missile defense systems. When modern military planners talk about integrated air defense, they're describing a concept that Curtis LeMay pioneered in that warehouse in England in 1942. The combat box also changed how military forces thought about training. Previous doctrine had focused on individual proficiency, making each pilot, each gunner, each bombardier as skilled as possible. The combat box required something different: collective excellence. It didn't matter how skilled an individual gunner was if the formation fell apart. It didn't matter how brave a pilot was if he couldn't maintain precise spacing under fire. This demanded a different kind of training regime. Crews practiced formation flying until it became muscle memory. They trained in simulators that replicated combat conditions. They learned to think not as individuals but as cells in a larger organism. This approach to training, emphasizing system-level performance over individual heroics, became the foundation for how modern military forces prepare for combat. The technological legacy is equally profound. The combat box revealed the importance of computational thinking in warfare. LeMay's calculations of firing arcs, probability of hits, optimal spacing, these were precursors to the computer-aided tactical planning that now dominates military operations. The combat box was analog computation applied to aerial warfare, but it demonstrated principles that would become central to the digital age. Why isn't the combat box formation more widely known? Partly because it's not as visually dramatic as a dogfight or as technologically impressive as a new aircraft design. It's mathematics made manifest, geometry applied to life and death. It's difficult to dramatize a three-dimensional array of aircraft maintaining precise spacing. But that difficulty shouldn't obscure the innovation's significance. There's also an element of institutional memory. After World War II, strategic bombing doctrine evolved. The introduction of jet engines, guided missiles, and eventually precision munitions changed the nature of aerial warfare. The massive formations of B-17s became obsolete, and with them, the detailed understanding of why the combat box had been necessary. The formation itself was remembered, but the mathematical principles that made it work, the human discipline required to execute it, the strategic impact it enabled, these faded from popular consciousness. Yet the principles endure. When modern fighter aircraft fly in formation, they're applying lessons learned from the combat box. Mutual support, overlapping fields of fire, the importance of maintaining formation discipline under stress. When ships position themselves in a carrier battle group, they're using spatial relationships pioneered by bomber formations. When satellites create a GPS constellation, they're implementing the same principle. Multiple units working together to create capabilities impossible for individual units. The combat box also represents something less tangible but equally important. It's a story about human adaptability in the face of catastrophic failure. In 1942, American bomber crews were dying at unsustainable rates. Rather than accepting this as an inevitable cost of war, innovators like Curtis LeMay refused to surrender to the mathematics of defeat. They reimagined how bombers could fight, trained men to execute that vision under impossible conditions, and changed the course of the war. For the men who flew in combat box formations, the experience was unlike anything else in warfare. Pilot William Wheeler described it as flying in a cloud of metal death that you're creating yourself. The noise was tremendous. 4 engines on your own aircraft, the engines of 17 other bombers around you, all of it at high altitude where the air was thin and every sound seemed sharper, more intense. The cold was brutal. At 25,000 feet, temperatures routinely dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. Gunners in the waist positions or the tail worked in areas that couldn't be fully pressurized or heated. Frost built up on the plexiglass, on the gun barrels, on the inside of oxygen masks. Frostbite was common. So was hypoxia. Oxygen system failures at that altitude could render a man unconscious in seconds, dead in minutes. Maintaining formation under these conditions required concentration that bordered on meditation. Bombardier John Morris recalled that formation flying was 99% boredom and 1% absolute terror, but you had to maintain perfect focus through both. Any lapse in attention could cause a collision. Aircraft flew with wingtips sometimes separated by less than 50 feet. A moment of inattention, a gust of wind, a pilot's hand twitching on the controls. Any of these could result in 2 aircraft tangling in midair, taking potentially 4 or 5 others down with them. The psychological burden was immense. Ball turret gunner Alan McGee described the particular horror of his position. Suspended beneath the aircraft in a rotating sphere of plexiglass, nothing beneath him but 3 miles of air and whatever enemy fighters were trying to kill him. "You're completely exposed," he said. "You can see everything. The ground, enemy fighters, friendly aircraft getting hit. You're part of the airplane but separate from it. If something goes wrong, you're the first to know and the last to be able to do anything about it." The discipline required to maintain formation while under attack defied every human instinct for self-preservation. Pilot Charles Cruikshank described attacking an Me-109 that made a head-on pass at his aircraft. "I could see his cannons firing. I knew he was aiming at me specifically. Every instinct told me to brake, to dive, to do something. But I held formation. The guy to my right, the guy to my left, they were counting on me to hold position so their gunners could engage. If I broke, I'd be leaving a gap in the defensive sphere. So I held formation, and I watched tracers going past my windscreen, and I trusted that the formation would keep me alive. That trust was not always rewarded. When an aircraft in formation took catastrophic damage, an engine fire, a direct hit to the cockpit, a wing sheared off by enemy fire, the other crews had to watch it happen, knowing they couldn't break formation to help, couldn't do anything except maintain their position and hope their gunners could avenge their friends. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant William O'Brien kept a journal throughout his tour of duty. One entry from March 1944 reads, "Watched the aircraft in the low squadron take a direct hit from flak today. The entire nose section just disappeared. The plane held formation for maybe 15 seconds. 15 seconds where the pilots were probably already dead, but the aircraft kept flying straight and level. Then it rolled left and went down. We held formation. Flew right past where they'd been. left a hole in the sky that closed up as we tightened the formation. By the time we reached the target, it was like they'd never been there. Dropped our bombs. Flew home. Tomorrow we do it again. The bond between crews in the same combat box was unlike any other military relationship. They weren't just fellow soldiers. They were components in a survival mechanism that only worked if everyone executed perfectly. Crews socialized together, trained together, and developed a level of implicit trust that went beyond friendship. They needed to know, without question, that the aircraft to their right would hold position, that the crew behind them would cover their six, that the formation would function as a single entity even under the most extreme stress. This created a unique form of survivor's guilt. When a crew completed their tour, typically 25 missions, and went home, they were leaving behind men who'd kept them alive through mathematical precision and collective discipline. Pilot Richard Peterson described it as abandoning family, even though he'd completed his required missions and had every right to return home. The guilt of leaving while others continued to face the same dangers haunted many veterans for the rest of their lives. The Sky over Rabaul, November 1943. The B-17s that entered that heavily defended airspace flew through it not as individual aircraft gambling on luck or pilot skill, but as a single, integrated weapon system. They emerged on the other side having demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Superiority often comes not from better individual weapons, but from better ways of using the weapons you have. The combat box formation wasn't just a tactical innovation. It was a philosophical shift, from heroic individualism to disciplined collectivism, from weapons as tools to weapons as systems, from warfare as art to warfare as applied mathematics. It saved thousands of lives by understanding that sometimes the best way to protect a soldier isn't better armor or faster engines, but better geometry. The men who flew these missions didn't think in these terms. They thought about reaching the target, dropping their bombs, and getting their crew home alive. They thought about the aircraft to their right and left, about maintaining spacing, about trusting that the formation would do what the mathematics promised it would do. They flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of enemy fighters with nothing protecting them but aluminum skin, mathematical principles, and each other. We remember World War II for its heroic moments. The individual aces with dozens of kills, the famous battles, the breakthrough technologies. But victory in total war rarely comes from individual heroism or single innovations. It comes from systems, from organizations, from thousands of people executing complex tasks with precision under conditions of extreme stress. The combat box formation represents this unglamorous but essential truth. Today, when we see aircraft flying in formation, whether military jets or airshow performers, we're watching a legacy that stretches back to those B-17s over Europe and the Pacific. The specific tactics have evolved. The technology has advanced beyond anything those crews could have imagined. But the underlying principle remains. Sometimes the whole is far more than the sum of its parts. The combat box formation exists now mostly in history books, in fading photographs of silver bombers arrayed in geometric patterns against cloudy skies, in the memories of aging veterans who remember what it felt like to hold position while the world exploded around them. But its lessons persist in every modern military doctrine that emphasizes integrated operations, in every commander who understands that superiority comes from how you organize and employ forces as much as from the forces themselves. Those 18 bombers over Rabaul demonstrated something profound, that innovation under pressure can change the course of wars, that mathematical precision can save lives, and that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is hold formation and trust in the strength of the group. The German and Japanese pilots who faced combat box formations learned this lesson at terrible cost. The American crews who flew in those formations learned it through survival. The sky is empty of B-17s now. The men who flew them are mostly gone. But the principle they demonstrated, that disciplined collective action, informed by mathematical thinking and executed with precision, can overcome seemingly impossible odds, That principle remains as relevant today as it was in the skies over Europe and the Pacific 8 decades ago. This is what it meant to fly the combat box. This is why Japanese pilots couldn't break through. This is the story of mathematics, discipline, and courage combining to change aerial warfare forever. And this is why we must remember it, not just as history, but as a lesson in what human beings can accomplish when they work together with precision, purpose, and absolute trust in each other. The formation held. The mission succeeded. The men came home. That simple truth, repeated across thousands of missions, helped win a war. And the principles that made it possible continue to shape how we think about conflict, cooperation, and the power of collective action under fire.